The night holds whispers that aren't meant for the light of day. Some secrets are buried deep, not in the ground, but in the forgotten corners of our minds, waiting for the quiet hours to stir. Tonight, we're gonna listen to a few of them. Take a moment, turn off the lights, put on your headphones. Let the ambient hum of the world fade away. What you're about to hear isn't always loud, but it resonates, settles in. It might just stay with you long after the screen goes dark, a low ember in the back of your thoughts. There's no escaping what we carry inside, and sometimes those burdens are shared. The air in the new house always felt used, not stale, but like it had been breathed by 100 different people for 100 different reasons. I was 17 that summer, and my parents had just bought a sprawling, neglected Victorian on the outskirts of Millersport, mostly for the land. It was a fixer-upper, and my dad, an amateur historian, was thrilled about the property's age. The previous owners, a reclusive elderly couple, had apparently moved out suddenly, leaving behind surprisingly little, except for one thing that caught my dad's eye in the dusty living room fireplace. A small, heavy, unadorned iron box, about the size of a shoebox, half buried in cold ash. He figured it was an old ash pan, but it was sealed. My dad, always curious, spent an afternoon trying to open it. It had no obvious latch, just a tight seam. Eventually, he used a chisel and hammer, prying it open with a soft, metallic groan. Inside, it wasn't ash. It was full of what looked like tightly packed, fine, almost flour-like white powder, and a single charred wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb. The bird was intricate, even burnt, with delicate wings and an open beak. Felt strangely light for wood. My dad shrugged, declared it old junk, and set the box on the mantelpiece, the bird beside it. He thought it was some kind of antique fire starter kit or an old family memento. That night, I kept smelling smoke. Not heavy, acrid smoke, but a faint, woody scent, like a distant campfire. Our house was old, so I blamed the chimney, or maybe a neighbor's bonfire carried on the breeze. It was summer after all. The smell was subtle enough that I only noticed it when the windows were closed, and it seemed to follow me. I'd drift off to sleep, and then a phantom wisp of smoke would prickle my nose, pulling me back to consciousness. It was annoying, a minor disturbance in the quiet of a new, unfamiliar house. I pulled my covers higher, trying to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination settling into a new place. A few days later, the smell intensified. My mom complained about it, too. We checked the attic, the basement, every outlet, but found nothing. One evening, I was walking past the living room and noticed a faint, reddish glow coming from the fireplace. My heart jumped. Had something smoldered? I peered inside, and there, nestled in the cold ash where the box had been found, were tiny, almost imperceptible red embers, pulsing faintly like distant stars. They weren't hot to the touch, just glowing. I called my dad. He poked at them with a stick, confused. Must be old embers reacting to humidity, he theorized, before sweeping them into the metal ash bucket. The next morning, the charred bird was gone from the mantelpiece. My dad searched, joking that a mouse must have taken it. Then I started hearing things. Soft, almost inaudible whispers, like dry leaves rustling, only they seemed to form words I couldn't quite catch. They were strongest when I was near the fireplace. I'd pause, straining to hear, but they'd always fade just as I focused. It made me feel like I was losing my mind, or perhaps the old house was playing tricks on my ears. My parents were busy with renovations, so I didn't mention it, not wanting to sound crazy. The smell of smoke became a constant companion, a ghost on my breath. Then the white powder started reappearing. Small, almost invisible traces on the floorboards around the fireplace. Then on the mantelpiece itself, even though we had cleaned it thoroughly. It was the same fine, flour-like substance that had been in the iron box. We'd sweep it up, and by morning there would be more. It was like the fireplace was weeping ash. My dad decided to seal the flue, thinking maybe something was blowing in from the chimney. The smell of smoke, however, didn't diminish. If anything, it became thicker, a heavy blanket that settled in the living room, seeping into the furniture and our clothes. One night, I woke up to the distinct smell of burning wood, sharp and immediate. I rushed downstairs, heart pounding, expecting to see flames. The living room was dark, but the fireplace stood out. It wasn't burning, but from within its sooty mouth came a sound, a low, guttural crackle, like dry branches catching. And then, the whispering started again, clearer this time, urgent, almost pleading. It wasn't English or any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a summons. I felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to reach into the darkness of the fireplace, to touch whatever was making that sound, to answer the whispers. I snapped on the light, and the sounds and whispers vanished instantly, replaced by absolute silence. But on the cold hearth, where the embers had been, was the little charred wooden bird. It was lying on its side, slightly singed, and its tiny, open beak was now facing directly towards the dark opening of the chimney. And around it, more of the fine white ash, dusted like snow. That's when I finally understood. The box wasn't an ash pan. It was a container, holding something back. And the bird wasn't a memento. It was a key, or a sacrifice. The fire that had burned it centuries ago, the fire that had created the ash it remembered. It wanted to be lit again. My dad, usually so logical, was unnerved by the bird's reappearance. We sealed the fireplace opening with a thick steel plate, mortaring it into place. We never mentioned the whispers or the feeling of being called. We just wanted it gone. The smell of smoke faded eventually, but sometimes on a cold, quiet night, I swear I can still catch a faint wisp of that woody scent, carried on the air, reminding me that some fires, once started, never truly go out. They just wait for someone to open the box again. And sometimes they send out a little bird, a small burnt messenger, to find a way back to the flame. The things we keep, the things we lose. Sometimes the line between them blurs, until you can't tell if you're holding something precious or something that's holding you. The weight of remembrance can be a heavy thing. But what about the absence? The smoke detector in my new apartment chirped low, a dying bird I couldn't quite place. Not even a week after I'd moved in. I was 24, finally out of my parents' house and into a small 2-bedroom place in a quiet part of town. Excited for the independence. The apartment was older, built sometime in the 70s, with slightly uneven floors and a few layers of questionable wallpaper under the current paint. But it was mine. I'd spent the first few days unpacking, sorting through boxes, and trying to figure out where everything would go. My desk was still covered in textbooks and charging cables, and the kitchen had a single pot and pan that I'd inherited from my aunt. It was a fresh start, or so I thought, despite the persistent, almost imperceptible scent of ash that clung to the air, especially in the evenings. I just figured the previous tenants had burned some dinner. The scent got stronger, though, specifically in the second bedroom, which I was using for storage. One afternoon, while looking for a particular box of old photos, I found it, tucked away in the back of the closet, half hidden by a forgotten pile of blankets, was a small, plain wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark, unvarnished wood, and felt surprisingly heavy. There was no latch, no lock, just a simple, almost seamless lid. The wood felt cool to the touch, and it smelled faintly of something charred, like a campfire that had been put out days ago. It wasn't one of my boxes, and I didn't remember seeing it during the initial walkthrough. I figured the previous tenant must have left it behind by accident, maybe forgotten it in the rush of moving. I set the box on my desk, intending to call the landlord about it, but work got busy, and it slipped my mind. A few days later, I was studying late, and the apartment had gotten chilly. I reached for my coffee mug, and my hand brushed against the wooden box. To my surprise, it was warm. Not just room temperature, but noticeably, strangely warm, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight all day, even though the room was dim and the window faced north. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. There was no power cord, no batteries, no obvious heat source. It was just a plain wooden box. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had absorbed some ambient heat from the laptop, or perhaps the old would just retained warmth differently. It was probably nothing. I told myself, just an old, forgotten item. That night, I woke up to a faint crackling sound. It was subtle, like dry leaves scuttling across pavement, or embers settling in a distant fireplace. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room, where I'd left the wooden box. I felt a prickle of unease. My first thought was the old electrical wiring in the building. I got up, moving quietly through the dark apartment. The crackling grew a little louder as I approached the living room, and I could smell that smoky scent again, stronger now. It wasn't acrid or burning, but the deep, earthy smell of old ash. I paused at the doorway, peering into the gloom. The room was still, the shadows deep and unmoving. The crackling stopped. I stood there for a long moment, my heart thumping, before deciding it was just my imagination, or maybe a neighbor's fireplace. The next morning, the crackling sound was gone, but the smoky smell lingered, faint but undeniable. I decided I couldn't ignore the box anymore. I picked it up, intending to finally open it. The lid felt incredibly tight, almost stuck. As I wrestled with it, a small, brittle photograph slipped out from a narrow crack in the side, landing on my desk. It was an old, sepia-toned picture, badly faded. It showed a family standing in front of what looked like a small, modest farmhouse. Their faces were blurry, indistinct, but their expressions seemed somber. The unsettling detail was that the edges of the photograph looked singed, almost like it had been held too close to a flame. It felt like a piece of history, hinting at something I didn't want to uncover. My hands trembled slightly as I put it back on the desk. I finally managed to pry the lid open. Inside, there was nothing but a layer of fine, dark ash, like what you'd find after a very old fire. No objects, no papers, just ash. I nudged it with my finger. It was still warm, even several days after I'd first noticed the box's strange temperature. As I pulled my finger back, a sharp, sudden burning sensation shot through it. It wasn't like touching something hot. It was deeper, more internal, like the heat was radiating from inside my bone. I yelped, pulling my hand away. There was no mark, no redness, nothing visible. But the pain was real, a deep, persistent ache that faded slowly. I stared at the ash-filled box, a cold dread settling in. This wasn't just an old forgotten item. There was something profoundly wrong with it, something that felt ancient and malevolent. Later that night, the smoke detector in the living room started chirping again, then went silent. Then it chirped once more, louder this time, and kept going. The smoky smell in the apartment became overwhelming, filling every room, burning my eyes slightly. It wasn't the smell of a cozy fireplace. It was the acrid, choking scent of a house actively on fire. I ran to the windows, throwing them open, but the smell only seemed to intensify. I checked the kitchen, the outlets, everything. There was no visible smoke, no flames, no source for the smell. It was coming from inside the walls, from everywhere. I grabbed the wooden box from my desk. It was radiating heat now, a palpable warmth that made my skin prickle. The crackling sound was back, not distant anymore, but loud, urgent. as if something was burning fiercely just inches away from me. I stumbled out of the apartment, clutching the box, the overpowering smell of smoke clinging to my clothes. The hallway was clear, no alarms going off in any other units. My neighbors were asleep. I rushed down the stairs and out into the cool night air. The moment I stepped outside, the smell of smoke vanished. The box in my hands was still warm, but the intense heat was gone. I stood there, shivering, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. It wasn't my apartment that was cursed. It was this box. This plain, dark wooden box, filled with ash and an unseen, consuming fire. I realized it was the same dark wood as the charred photograph. This wasn't just a leftover item. It was a vessel, a container for something that never truly burned out, something that remembered its destruction too well. I drove to a desolate stretch of road outside of town, pulled over, and threw the wooden box as far as I could into a dense patch of woods. I didn't care about getting it back or what might happen to it out there. All I wanted was for it to be gone from my life. I never went back to that apartment. I broke my lease, ate the penalty, and moved across state lines within the month. I still wake up sometimes to a faint, phantom smell of smoke, or the sound of distant crackling, even now, years later. And sometimes, when my hand brushes against something unexpectedly warm, a cold chill, far worse than any burning sensation, runs through me, a reminder of the fire that found a way to follow. That chill isn't just the night air. It's the feeling that something has shifted, an invisible tremor. What if the echoes of the past aren't just memories, but a persistent presence, reaching out through the silence, demanding to be heard? The first thing I noticed when we moved into the old house on Miller Street wasn't the peeling paint or the overgrown yard, but the small, tarnished brass bell hanging by a thin chain above the fireplace in the living room. It was the kind you'd see in old movies, with a tiny wooden handle, clearly not decorative. My parents, practical people, just shrugged. Probably an old servant call bell, Dad speculated, already thinking about how to patch the roof. I was 19, just starting college, and honestly, I was more concerned with unpacking my books than with antique house fixtures. The house itself had a good vibe, solid and old, built in the 1940s. We got a good deal on it because the previous owner had passed away suddenly, and their kids just wanted to offload it quickly. A few weeks in, I was home alone one Tuesday afternoon, studying for a history midterm. Mom was at work, Dad was out running errands. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Suddenly, a faint, metallic ring echoed from the living room. It was soft, almost delicate, but unmistakable. The bell. I paused, my pen hovering over my notebook. I walked into the living room, but the bell was perfectly still. Swaying wasn't even an option. The windows were closed, no breeze. I figured maybe the old house was just settling, making strange noises. I went back to my studying, trying to brush it off as my imagination, or maybe just a trick of the old pipes. The sound, however, lingered in my head. It happened again a few days later, this time late at night. I was asleep, but the distinct, clear ring of that bell woke me up. It was probably 2 a.m. My heart thumped. I lay in bed, listening, straining to hear any other sounds. Nothing, just the slow tick of my alarm clock. I got up, carefully, and walked to my bedroom door, peering into the dark hallway. The living room was at the end of the hall. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, my breath held, but there was no further sound. I told myself it must have been a dream, or maybe the old house's plumbing again, even though it sounded nothing like pipes. It was a bell, after all, a tiny brass bell, and it shouldn't ring on its own. The next morning, I brought it up at breakfast. Mom looked at Dad, and he just shook his head. "Old houses make noises, son. You'll get used to it." But Mom had a thought. I heard something from Mrs. Davison next door when we were moving in. She mentioned the previous owners had a terrible house fire decades ago. Burned out the whole living room, apparently. They rebuilt it, but it took them years. This was news to me. I had thought the house was always in good condition. Mrs. Davison had also mentioned that the fire started in the fireplace. That's why she said the owners never used it again, even after the rebuild. I looked at the bell again, still above the cold, unused hearth. Armed with this new information, the bell's sporadic rings suddenly felt less like random house noises. That night I couldn't sleep. The thought of the fire, right there in the living room, and that bell hanging above it was unsettling. I got up and went to the living room. The fireplace was clean, almost sterile, like it had been scrubbed and polished for show, but never actually used. There was no soot, no smell of smoke, just the faint scent of old wood and dust. The brass bell glinted dully in the light from the street lamp outside. It looked harmless, almost charming, but knowing its history, knowing where it hung, gave me chills. I reached out, my fingers hovering near it, but I didn't touch it. I couldn't bring myself to. The rings became more frequent. Not daily, but every 2 or 3 nights. Always in the early hours, usually between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Always just one clear, sharp ring. I started noting the times. It wasn't random anymore. Felt intentional. One night, I was on my laptop in the living room, pulling an all-nighter for a paper. It was around 1:30 a.m. The house was utterly silent. I heard a faint creak from the hallway, which I rationalized as the house settling. Then the bell rang. I jumped, spilling my coffee. It was right there, above me. I looked up, heart hammering, but the bell was still. My eyes scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. Nothing, but the air felt cold, despite it being summer. A prickling sensation ran down my spine. A few weeks later, the ringing stopped. I almost felt relief, thinking whatever it was had moved on. Then something else started. The smoke alarm right outside my bedroom door would chirp erratically. Not the full, blaring alarm, just a single, sharp chirp, like it was low on battery. But we just replaced all the batteries. I check it, press the test button, and it would give a solid, loud blast. Then silence for a few hours before another single chirp. It happened at odd times, sometimes day, sometimes night. It was annoying, a minor inconvenience, but it gnawed at me. The bell was by the fireplace where the fire started. The smoke alarm was right outside my room, where I slept, feeling safe. Felt like a progression, a shift. One evening, I was drifting off to sleep when a faint smell reached me. Smoke. Not a strong, acrid smell of a house on fire, but a subtle, lingering scent of burnt wood and ash, like an old campfire that had long since died. I sat up, sniffing the air. It was faint, but it was there. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and checked the hallway. Nothing. My parents were asleep. I went to the living room. The smell was strongest there, right by the fireplace. It was unmistakably smoke. I looked at the bell. It hung there silent, still, but the air felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It wasn't just old house smells anymore. It felt like a memory, a terrible one, being replayed, wafting through the house, clinging to the walls. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the silence, straining for any sound, any scent. Around 2:15 a.m., the smoke alarm outside my room chirped. Just once. I flinched. Then, a few seconds later, from the living room, I heard the delicate, unmistakable ring of the brass bell. One perfect, clear note. I got out of bed. As I walked towards the living room, a single, tiny red ember, no bigger than a grain of rice, glowed faintly in the center of the completely empty, clean fireplace grate. It pulsed once, a tiny heartbeat of fire, and then vanished. There was nothing to burn, nothing to create it, just an empty grate and a bell. The fire had left its mark, and something somewhere was still trying to call for help. We moved out a month later. My parents thought I was being dramatic, but even they admitted the smoke alarm problem was peculiar. I never told them about the Ember. The new place we found is smaller, but it's modern with no fireplace, no old brass bells. I thought I'd be relieved, but sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and still, I catch myself listening for that faint, metallic ring. I know it's not here, but the memory of it, and the lingering smell of phantom smoke, sometimes makes me wonder, what if it wasn't the house that was cursed? What if it was the bell, or the fire itself, that followed me? That fire never should have been lit, and whatever was trapped in its memory, it hasn't finished calling for attention yet. We search for comfort, for warmth, for a sense of peace. But sometimes what we find instead is a colder truth, a realization that the things we build to protect ourselves can also become the very walls that trap us. The smoke clears, but the residue remains. The car key was still warm when I picked it up off the kitchen counter, even though my dad had left for his night shift at the plant almost 2 hours earlier. It was a Saturday night, I was 17, and my parents were pretty strict about me not touching the family car, a beat-up '98 Honda Civic, unless it was an emergency. But this felt like an emergency, or at least the kind of teenage crisis that seemed like one. My girlfriend Sarah was at a party a few towns over and her ride home had fallen through. She was calling me every 5 minutes, practically in tears, and I just couldn't leave her stranded. I knew borrowing the car would be a huge risk, but the alternative felt worse. The Civic's keys always hung on a specific hook by the back door, so finding them on the counter felt a little off, like Dad had been in a hurry and just tossed them there. I grabbed the keys, pocketing them with a nervous flutter in my stomach. The house was completely silent, my mom already asleep upstairs. I crept out, the night air cool and still. The Civic was parked in the driveway, a shadow under the streetlight. As I got in, I noticed something small and dark on the passenger seat. It was a smooth, palm-sized river stone, almost perfectly round, but with a strange, smoky discoloration running through its center, like an internal swirl of ash. I'd never seen it before. Dad was into collecting odd rocks sometimes, so I figured it was just one of his latest finds he'd forgotten about. I picked it up, feeling its unexpected warmth. It wasn't hot, just a lingering, unnatural warmth, like it had been sitting in the sun all day, even though it was well after midnight. I shrugged, tossed it into the glove compartment, and started the car. The drive to Sarah's friend's house was usually a straight shot down Route 17, about 20 minutes. But tonight, something felt off. The streetlights seemed dimmer, the familiar road signs blurring more than usual. I found myself taking a wrong turn, ending up on a narrow, unpaved road that snaked through a patch of woods I didn't recognize. The GPS on my phone kept losing signal, and the road ahead was swallowed by the darkness. Panic started to bubble. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn led deeper into the trees. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faintly acrid, like old burnt wood. I rolled down the window, hoping for a clearer view, but the smell only intensified, making my throat itch. Then the car started acting up. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, the radio cutting in and out with static bursts. I tried to rationalize it: old car, bad wiring, maybe the damp air. But the smoky smell was getting stronger now, and I swore I could feel a faint heat radiating from the glove compartment where I'd stashed that strange stone. I reached over, my fingers brushing against the latch. It was definitely warm, almost hot to the touch. I pulled my hand back, startled. It was just a rock, right? A geological oddity. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Why would a rock be warm? And why was it suddenly in Dad's car on the passenger seat like it had been placed there specifically for me to find? A thin wisp of smoke started curling from the glove compartment, barely visible in the dim light of the flickering dash. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just a malfunctioning car. This was something else. I slammed on the brakes, the Civic skidding to a halt on the gravel road. The smoke grew thicker, filling the small space of the car with that same acrid, burnt smell. I fumbled for the glove compartment latch, my fingers burning as I finally got it open. The smoky stone sat inside, glowing faintly with an internal reddish light, and wisps of actual smoke were pouring off of it. It looked like it was smoldering from within. I stared at it, transfixed, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't natural. This wasn't normal. I snatched the stone, yelping as its heat seared my palm. Felt like holding a burning coal. I threw it out the window, watching it tumble into the dark woods. The moment it left my hand, the smoke in the car dissipated instantly. The dashboard lights stabilized, and the engine hummed normally. I was shaking, my breath ragged. I looked into the woods where the stone had landed, half expecting to see it glowing, but it was just darkness. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A faint, orange glow, deep in the woods, almost imperceptible at first. It was small, like a distant campfire, but it was growing, spreading. It wasn't a campfire. It was fire. Real fire, consuming the dry underbrush, spreading with an unnatural speed. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The warm key, the stone, the smell of smoke, the wrong turn, the car trouble, the fire in the woods. It wasn't a coincidence. That stone, whatever it was, had caused this. I fumbled for my phone, finally getting a signal, and called 911, my voice cracking as I tried to explain what was happening. The operator sounded skeptical, asking for cross streets I didn't know. As I spoke, the orange glow in the woods intensified, painting the sky with an eerie, flickering light. Soon, I could hear sirens in the distance, growing louder, closer. They weren't for me, not yet, but for the fire. The fire I had started, unwittingly, by throwing that cursed stone into the dry woods. Firefighters eventually found me, shaken and babbling, and the fire was contained after an hour, but not before it had scorched a significant patch of protected forestland. I told them about the stone, about the car, about everything. They looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. They found no trace of any unusual stone, just charred earth and smoldering embers. My parents were furious, of course, but mostly just relieved I was safe. They never believed the part about the stone, blaming my reckless driving and teenage imagination. I didn't get grounded for long. The bigger issue was the potential legal trouble for starting a brush fire, which thankfully was never pinned on me directly. The official report cited unknown causes for the blaze. But I knew what had caused it. Weeks later, I found out Dad had been trying to get rid of that stone for months. He'd found it in the ruins of an old, abandoned mill that had burned down mysteriously years ago, taking with it a whole family that lived nearby. He said he kept trying to bury it, throw it in the river, even smash it with a hammer, but it always reappeared, sometimes in his car, sometimes on his nightstand. He just never told anyone because he thought it sounded crazy. The day I took the car, he said he'd intentionally left the keys on the counter, hoping I'd find the stone and finally be rid of it for him. He was desperate. And now, sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying in bed, I still catch that faint, acrid smell of burnt wood, like the fire is still looking for something to consume. These stories, these glimpses into the shadows, they linger because they touch on something universal. The fear of the unknown, yes, but also the dread of what we already know, deep down. The quiet horror of the everyday, twisted just enough to remind us how fragile our sense of security truly is. It's the feeling that even in the most familiar places, something profoundly unsettling can take root. For a new story every week, consider subscribing to Scareverse.